Okay, so this is Beat Making 101 in Pro Tools. For this particular tutorial, we're going to assume that you've already taken care of things like setting up the session, naming it properly, saving things into the data drive, gone through and done all that you need to do regarding the playback engine and all of those things. And we're just really going to be talking about the things that are new in this project that were not in the previous Mixing 101 Pro Tools project. If for any reason you can't remember how those things work or how to start up, you really do want to go back and review that information. Also, there's instructions, written instructions that cover a lot of that as well for this project. But this video, I'm going to try to be as straightforward as I can just regarding the new technical elements of how Pro Tools works so that you can create a beat, which is the goal of this project. You'll notice some things are going to be similar to what we did in the version of this project, Beat Making 101 in Ableton Live, but there are a few things that are different. Some things are easier, some things are harder, some things are just different in general, and part of this is you getting a chance to experience both to see which one you prefer depending on what circumstance you're working in. So anyway, the very first thing we're going to do up here is we're going to create a click track or a metronome for us to follow along with while we're playing. So I'm going to track. I'm not going to go to new, I'm going to go to create click track. And this is going to create that metronome. It's labeled click right here. And if I hit the transport play button right here, remember if you don't have a transport or anything else up here along the top of your Pro Tools edit screen, you can go to this little circle here in the upper right, click on the arrow pointing down, and select any element that you need. So anyway, I'm going to hit play, and we're going to listen to our click track for a moment. There we go. Now I can change that tempo if I want by coming over here to this little red dot, or excuse me, little red triangle, and I can double click that, and now I can go in and I can type in whatever I want. I want to change it to 96, make it a little slower, hit play, and it's slower. I can also go in, and if I have this window up, I can use my T key on the typing keyboard and I can actually tap a tempo. I'm going to pick a moderate tempo here. I'm just going to use the default 120 for this particular exercise, but the point is I can change it. Now if you cannot see this tempo ruler here, then go over to this little black drop-down menu in the top left, click on that, and again, similar to how we pulled up the transport when we needed it, I've got a checklist. Anything checked, I see. Anything not checked, I don't. You'll see I took away the tempo ruler. I'm going to bring it back because I need it for this project. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to do. The next thing that we are going to do is we are going to go in and we are going to get an actual track to record on and an instrument to play on that track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to track. I'm going to go to new. Now, different tracks have different purposes, and this applies in every DAW, digital audio workstation. This is not just in Pro Tools. This is GarageBand. This is Ableton Live. This is, you name it, different tracks, different purposes. Okay, so we want a particular type of track in this case. We want a virtual instrument track, and we want it to be stereo, not mono. Mono means there's one source. Stereo means there are two left and right. We're going to change mono here to stereo. We're going to change audio track to instrument track. Audio tracks, for what it's worth, are for anything that comes from outside the computer, and we would need an interface for that. In this case, we're just using our headphones, so we don't have an interface plugged in. And we don't have audio coming in from outside. Everything that we're going to be doing is coming from inside the computer. So we need an instrument track to do that. All right, we're going to leave samples and ticks alone. We're not going to worry about the plus sign, and we're just going to hit create. So now I have a track. It's called Inst1. Now, I'm only going to be using one track for this project, so it's not the end of the world to leave it Inst1, but it's a really good habit to get into the pattern of always changing the name immediately to whatever the source is going to be. Now in this case, I know it's going to be a drum machine called Boom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, double click on the name here, Inst1, gives me this window. I'm going to type in this field that says name the track. Instead of Inst1, I'm going to call it Boom. And I'm going to hit OK, and you'll notice changes the name over here. The next thing I need to do is I am going to go in and I'm going to insert that drum machine Boom onto my track. The way I do that is actually very similar to what I did in the Mixing 101 project with the equalizers and the compressors. I'm going to go up here to this first slot in my insert column. I'm going to click on the dot. I'm going to go to multi-channel plugin, and this time I'm going to go all the way down to instrument. Now once again, I have a lot of additional instruments in this particular studio setup that you may or may not have, but the one we want regardless is boom. Select that right there, click it, and it's going to pop up this drum machine for us. Okay, so here's boom and its interface, and if I want to go through on the mouse and click things like kick, I can hear the kick sound. I can hear the snare sound, I can hear the rib, whatever it is I want to do, I can hear all of these different things. The other thing I can do to trigger sounds is that I can use a MIDI controller, which I need for this project anyway, and I have different buttons, different keys on my MIDI controller are going to control different properties. So for example, this C here, I don't have anything. Why don't I have anything? I don't have anything because I haven't made that last internal connection. I need to tell Pro Tools what track I want to be working with. I did this on purpose to make sure that you would see this, by the way. I have to have Record Enable selected so it knows use this track with this instrument. Now that it's Record Enabled, when I hit the key, there's my kick, there's my snare, there's another snare one, different sounds, different things. I'm primarily going to use the kick, the snare, and this hi-hat for this project. Okay? So, again, I can close this off if I want, or I can bring it up visually. There's something else that you do need to know about boom, however, and that's this. On your MIDI controller, some keys will trigger individual sounds. Some keys will trigger patterns. And it depends on what octave you're in, which patterns you might be able to access. So for example, that's pattern 1, this is pattern 3, 4, and you can see this grid here is changing, and you can actually go in and click on these little dots and change the pattern if you want and actually create your own. There's a lot of really cool things you can do with boom. But for right now, we're just going to make a very basic beat in Pro Tools, kind of similar to what we did in Ableton. In any case, my point is make sure you take a moment to figure out which keys are going to give you patterns and which keys are going to give you individual sounds. Because for this project, we really need the individual sounds. So, I'm going to click this visual off for the drum machine. It's still active, but I want to have access to my entire track here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the size of my track here. I'm going to stretch it out. And the way I did that is I simply went up to the very bottom of the track. My cursor turns into that odd little plus sign, and I can grab the bottom of the track and literally just make it wider or not. It's just a visual reference. I'm going to make it nice and wide. I'm going to change clips over here. I'm going to change that to notes. This gives me a better piano roll to work with, similar to the one that I had in Ableton. Now, I can click on notes on the piano roll here, and I get a bass drum, snare, hi-hat, and so on. I'm going to use my MIDI controller, though, because I want you to see some functionality things in Pro Tools that we haven't previously gotten to. So, and by the way, in Pro Tools, out of the box, as it were, you can't use your computer's keyboard to work as a MIDI controller. You have to have your own separate MIDI controller. Is that good? Is that bad? Has to deal with a lot of things about control and creative options, and it really is going to be circumstantial for you. But in any case, we need to use a MIDI controller for this project to work. So I'm record enabled, I've got boom, I've got notes view, I've got the track nice and wide. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to record a performance of some kind using my MIDI controller. I'm going to practice to make sure I know which notes are where on the keyboard, and I'm just going to try to play a very basic beat to the click track as it's playing. So I have my track record enabled. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to record enable my session, and when I hit play, it's going to start recording anything that I perform. So here we go. There's my click. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I have a basic beat. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. I'm going to go back to the beginning using my transport here, go all the way back. I can also use the return key if I wish, not the enter key, the return key. Make sure you're paying attention to which is which. I can hit the space bar or my transport to play it. So let's take a listen. Got a measure here, and here we go. It's not too bad, and if you look really close, you'll notice that the notes are close to being on the grid, but they're not quite there. So I have a couple of options for what I can do. One is I am in slip mode right now. Slip mode means that I can move anywhere I want on the grid or not on the grid. It gives me a lot of very, very specific control. I can take my grabber tool and I can grab a note, for example, this one here, this first kick drum, and I can slide it anywhere I want. And I can try to realign things. You'll notice I can go up and down and change sounds. I can do whatever I want here. But I want to try and get that right on the line. It's doable. It's not ideal, though, moving it like this. I'm not quite sure if I'm there or not, and I have to do every single one of them, and it's time-consuming and tedious. However, there is another way I can do it. What I can do is I can take this grabber tool, and I can just simply select everything. And you'll hear it trigger all the sounds as you run over them really fast, but I now have all of my notes selected. Similar to what we did in Ableton Live, I can quantize. The way I do it is I select the notes I want to quantize. You can actually do this with anything, not just notes. And I'm going to go to Event. I'm going to do Event Operations. I'm going to go select Quantize. I'm going to move this window slightly out of the way so you can see it happen. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to simply do Note On. What quantizing grid do I want to use? Well, I know that these were basically all on eighth notes. So I'm going to choose, instead of 16ths, I'm going to choose eighth notes. And I'm going to hit Apply. And watch what happens when I hit Apply. It immediately shifts everything to that grid. Here's before. One more time. Here's after. And this is the same when you're quantizing pretty much in any piece of software. So I can get rid of that now. And now when I hit play, check it out. I'm right on that click. My grid's perfectly aligned. We're in pretty good shape, and that's what I'm looking for. I am looking for a steady, consistent beat. But what if I don't want to have to deal with quantizing afterwards? What if I would like to try and have this just go straight in with a record quantize option, just like I had in Ableton? Well, in Pro Tools, I can do that as well. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to get rid of all of these notes. I'm going to re-record over it. So how do I get that to work? The idea of recording to the grid exactly as I'm performing things. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Event, and I am going to go over to Event Operations again, and I'm going to go down to Input Quantize, and I'm going to select that. Very similar menu, but you'll notice up here, Input Quantize, and in fact, I can actually move amongst all of those event operations through here. But I want the input one. I need to enable it. This is very important or it will not work. Now, what grid do I want to use? I'm going to do eighth notes again. And now when I hit record, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning of my session. Press record. Record enabled on the track. Press record enable on the session. Hit play. And by the way, I don't even need this up any longer. I can get rid of this. I'm going to hit play and start recording again. Here we go. And notice every single note is absolutely perfectly in line on the grid. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. Get the idea? Everything's perfectly in line. That's the idea. Can you get a beat that is steady and consistent, just like in Ableton, but in Pro Tools? One other function I wanted you to be aware of. If you can't see the detail here, it's because you weren't zoomed in enough. The way to do that is to make sure you have your zoom tools. And again, up in the right corner here with this little triangle pointing down, make sure you have expanded transport. Make sure you have all of these different things, including zoom controls, which are over here. And I can zoom out. See how it got smaller? I can zoom in. If you're zoomed out too far, though, you can really lose track of things. If you're zoomed in too far, you can really lose track of things as well. So you're going to want to find a comfortable medium. In any case, Good way to get started in Pro Tools. Make a beat. I'm excited to hear what you come up with in class.